3. No moves. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to board. 6. Red pawn to board. 2. Red pawn to 33. Your turn. 4. No moves. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 33. 1. Red pawn to 34. Your turn. 5. No moves. Red's turn. 4. Red pawn to 38. Your turn. 2. No moves. Red's turn. 3. Red pawn to 41. Your turn. 4. No moves. Red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 46. Your turn. 5. No moves. Red's turn. 4. Red pawn to 50. Your turn. No move. Red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 35. Your turn. 6. Pawn 1. Red player. Roll. Button. 5. Yellow pawn to 6. Red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 3. Your turn. 5. Yellow pawn to 11. Red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 4. Your turn. 4. Yellow pawn to 15. Red's turn. 3. Red pawn to 7. Your turn. 2. Yellow pawn to 17. Red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 8. Your turn. 6. Pawn 2 in base. Red player. 2 in base. Roll. Button. Select pawn 1. Red player. Guess your red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 14. 2. Red pawn to 16. Your turn. Roll. 3. Select pawn 1 on 20. Your red player. Guessed under red's turn. 3. Red pawn to 19. Your turn. 2 in base. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll. Menu. Roll. Button. Select pawn to pawn 1. Red player. Guessed on red's turn. 4. Red pawn to 23. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll. Button. Select pawn 1. Red player. Get your red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 24. Your turn. 2 in roll. Button. Select pawn 1. Red player. Guessed underscore red's turn. 4. Messed red pawn to 31. Kicked yellow pawn on 31 off board. 4. Red pawn to 31. Your turn. To roll. Button. 4. Yellow pawn to 5. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn moves to goal stairway step 5. 2. Red pawn to 33. Your turn. 6. Pawn 1 in base. Red player. Guessed 2. Roll. Button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on 1. Your pawn 2 on 5. Can pawn 1 on 1. Save. Can red player. Guessed underscore red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 33. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll. Button. 2. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on your turn. Select pawn 1 on 5. Red player. Guessed on red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 35. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll. 2. Select pawn 1 on your turn. Yellow pawn to 9. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 39. 6. Red pawn to 45. 2. Red pawn to 47. Your turn. Roll. 4. Select pawn 1 on red player. Guess your turn. Red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 49. Your turn. Red 2 in base. Your turn. 2 in roll button. 4. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 red player. Guest underscore red's turn. 1. Red pawn moves to goal. 2. Red pawn to 51. Your turn. Roll. 1. Select pawn 1 on 17. Red player. Guess red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 52. Your turn. Roll. 3. Select pawn 1. Red player. Guess your red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 2. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 2 on your turn. Yellow pawn to 10. Red's turn. 2 in roll. Disable button. 2. Red pawn to 4. Your turn. Menu. Button. Double tap with roll button. Your select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on 21. Pawn 2 on 10. Can move. Yellow pawn to 13. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 10. 1. Red pawn to 11. Your turn. Roll button. 5. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on 21. Pawn 2 on 13. Red player. Guest underscore red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 16. Your turn. Roll. 1. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1, pawn 2 on 18. Red player. Guest red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 17. Your turn. Roll. 1. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on your turn. Pawn 2 on red player. Guest red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 19. Your turn. Roll. 4. Select pawn 1 on 21. Your turn. Yellow pawn to 25. Red's turn. 3. Red pawn to 22. Your turn. 2 in roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on 25. Red player. Guest on red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 40. Your turn. Roll. 2. Select pawn 1 on 27. Your turn. Yellow pawn to 29. Red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 41. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll button. Select pawn 1 on 29. Red player. Guest underscore red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 46. Your turn. 2. Roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1. Red player. Guest your turn. 2 in base. Roll button. 1. Select pawn 1 on 39. Can move. Yellow pawn to 40. Red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 40. Your turn. 2. Roll button. 3. Select pawn 1 on 40. Your turn. Yellow pawn to 43. Red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 48. Your turn. Roll. 4. Select pawn 1. Red player. Get your turn. Red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 49. Your turn. Roll. 3. Select pawn 1 on 47. Your turn. Yellow pawn to 50. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 3. 3. Red pawn to 6. Your turn. 2 in base. Roll. 2 and roll. But your turn. Select pawn to pawn 1 on 50. Can move. Red player. Guessed on red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 12. 1. Red pawn to 13. Your turn. To roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 2 on your turn. Yellow pawn to 26. Red player. Guest underscore 97,032 in base. Your roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 on 51. Red player. Guest under red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 19. 6. Red pawn to 25. 2. Red pawn moves to goal stairway step 2. Your turn. 1. Select pawn 1 your turn. Select pawn 1 3 away from pawn 2 on 26. Red player. Guessed on red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 46. 1. Red pawn to 47. Your turn. Menu button. Roll button. 5. Your yellow pawn to 32. Red's turn. 4. Red pawn moves to goal. 3. Red pawn to 50. Your turn. 2. Select pawn to pawn 1 3 away from pawn 2 on your turn. Red player. Guessed on red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 3. Your turn. 2 roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn disable. Your pawn 2 on 34. Red player. Guessed underscore not 2 roll button. 4. Yellow pawn to 44. Red's turn. 4. Red pawn to 7. Your turn. Double tap with 2 menu button. Roll. 5. Your turn. Yellow pawn to 49. Red's turn. 2. Red pawn to 9. Your turn. Select pawn to play. Pawn 1 3 away from goal. Your turn. Pawn 2 on 49. Pawn 1 3 away from goal. Can move. Yellow pawn moves to goal stairway step 4. Red's turn. 5. Red pawn to 14. Your turn. Roll. 4. Yellow pawn moves to goal stairway step 2. Red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 15. Your turn. 1. Select pawn 1 2 away from goal. Pawn 2 4. Your turn. Yellow pawn moves to goal stairway step 3. Red's turn. 3. Red pawn to 18. Your turn. Red 2 and roll button. Select pawn to play. Pawn disabled. Pawn disabled. Pawn 2 3 away from goal. Cannot move. Disabled. Pawn 1 2 away from goal. Cannot move. Pawn 3 invade. Red player. 1 roll. 2. Select pawn to play. Select pawn to pawn 1 2 away from red player. Guest underscore 1 in base. Roll. 1. Select pawn to play. Pawn disabled. Pawn 2 3 away from goal. Can move. Pawn 3 on 1. Red player. Guest on red's turn. 1. Red pawn to 19. Your turn. Roll. 6. Select pawn to play. Your turn. Pawn disabled. Pawn 3 on 2. Can move. Pawn 4 in red player. Guest underscore 97,000. Roll button. Select pawn to pawn 2 3 away from goal. Can move. Yellow pawn moves to goal stairway step 4. Red's turn. 6. Red pawn to 25. 2. Red pawn moves to goal stairway step 2. Your turn. 3. Select pawn disabled. Your turn. Pawn disabled. Pawn 3 on 2. Pawn disabled. Pawn 1. Pawn disabled. Pawn 3 on 2.